welcome everyone to the final meetup of 2021. We are closing it out with my friend Danielle Stein Fairhurst. I'm just going to do a quick little intro here before we release it to her. So we're into the welcome and overview section right now, and we'll have it into Danielle's hands within the next 5 minutes or so. The first thing I want to do is just throw out a big thanks to the sponsors, Excel Guru and SkillWave, that make this thing happen. Excel Guru, of course, is my company, and SkillWave is the training division of our company. We're the ones that pull the speakers together and host the thing and get it all going and whatnot. And I'm looking forward to actually making that a little bit more obvious, actually, come 2022. Big thanks to Microsoft as well. They're the ones that provide the software, obviously provide the speakers a lot of the time as well, give us a lot of support, so I want to say a thanks to them. And the final thing I want to throw out here is just, again, a quick nod to my software product, Monkey Tools, which will help you build better data models faster in Excel and audit them as well, even audit Power BI models. It is the only tool on the market that we are aware of today that will actually allow you to import a Power BI model back into Excel. So if that is something that you need to think about, you should definitely check out our Monkey Tools add-in. Our next meetup that we have, as I say, this is the last one for 2021, and I see that we've got a date that's not quite correct on this, but on Thursday, January 6th in 2022, we're going to be having Cristiano Galvao come, and he's going to be showing us some data analysis with Microsoft Excel. And then for all of you who are familiar with our meetups, you'll all know Joseph Yates that does our What's New in Power BI. We're actually giving Joseph a full hour to go and talk about Python integration in Power BI on Thursday, January 20th. So just remember that there is no Power BI meetup for this month. We're going to take the rest of the month off and let everybody enjoy the holiday season and whatnot, but we'll be back in January with Cristiano. If you missed it, I'm not sure how you could if you come to our meetups, but my book is finally available and shipping on from Mr. Excel and from Accelerator BI and Amazon. So it makes a fantastic book. If you're looking to up your Power Query game, I highly recommend that you check it out. We're super proud of it, and I got to tell you, this is it right here. It is a satisfying book to hold, nice and heavy. So lots of good stuff in there. Last thing I want to mention is that we have a Black Friday promo on at SkillWave right now. This runs until the end of tomorrow, so you're running out of time to take advantage of it. It's 20% off all of our courses on things like dimensional modeling, our self-service BI boot camps, Matt's Supercharged Power BI courses. And for every person that actually purchased a course or a book or anything else that you get here, you actually get exclusive or access to our exclusive Ask Me Anything session with myself and Matt that we'll be doing on December 9th. So it's only for those that actually purchased from us during this period. So if you want to jump on that, it is not too late. You can head to that little URL there, skillwave.training Black Friday, but we've got a short domain in there to make it a little easier. I'll throw that into the chat once I'm done. And the last slide that I've got for this one, of course, is if you'd like to come and speak to our group, we would love to have you. Just fill out this little survey right here at xlguru.ca/speakatvanpug, and we will get you on our stage. And on that note here, that's the last slide that I got. So I am now going to turn it over to Danielle. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Danielle, I'm going to let you throw it back to you.
Yeah, sure.
And we'll let you run with your feature presentation.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks for having me. Let me just share. And
I keep forgetting to mention this part too, Danielle. So I'll just throw this out as we go on today, like you normally do. But for those that are new here, I will be moderating the chat as well. So if you've got questions, fire them into the chat window, and if they're technical, I'll probably try and answer them so that Danielle doesn't have to worry about those. But if they're not, if they're related to the presentation, which is what we're hoping they are, then I'll interrupt Danielle at key points where it makes some sense and get those questions to her so that she can answer your questions as well. So there you go.
Yeah. Do feel free to just jump in with any questions. I'm going to try to see the chat. I'm not sure whether I'm going to be able to see it as we go, but do feel free to just to unmute yourself or to drop a question, and Ken will interrupt me, and if it's relevant or even if it's not, that's completely fine. So I forgot to mention, Ken, it is not the second, it is the third today. Yeah. because I'm.
Because you live in the future. I forgot about that little wrinkle in nuance. Yeah. But you know what, Danielle? I'm an accountant. We always live in the past. That's the way it goes. So this is a normal place.
That's true. Okay. All right, let's get started. So we're talking about best practice financial modeling today. So this is me. I recently became an MVP as well. I've written a couple of books, and I just received this one, which is the first edition of the Dummies book in Portuguese. And Cristiano, who is your next speaker, he did the translation for that. But we actually have the second edition coming out in late January, so that's very exciting. So I know how you feel, Ken. Getting a new book out is really exciting. So the first book was we're up to the third edition, and with the Dummies book, we're now on the second edition. So I'm a financial modeler first and foremost, but I do absolutely love Excel. Excel and financial modeling is pretty much what I live and breathe. So I thought we could perhaps just start by doing a bit of a poll. Now, I know we've got the chat there, but it would be nice if we could. I'd like to sort of get an idea of what your definition is of financial modelling. So if you've got your phone handy, you could just, I think everybody's got the hang now of how QR codes work nowadays. So if you could just put your phone up and pop that in, you should see the question there. What is your definition of financial modelling? And then I'd like to find out how much financial modelling have you done. So let me just see. These are some. So this is some answers that people have given me in the past, and I can see people are starting to add to it. So it's just really interesting to see what people's definition of financial modelling is, and I can see a lot of people are saying forecasting, Excel. We'll talk about is it just Excel? Is it a VLOOKUP? Spreadsheeting. So lots of the word forecasting is coming up a lot. Valuation, scenarios. We'll certainly talk about scenarios. Great to see. Historical, so historical and future. Very often we use the historical data that we get from the numbers and then use that to forecast out. Debt, feasibility, some really interesting results there. So I might just stop that now. Give it another minute to see if anyone else wants to do. Okay. And let's see. Let's do the second one now. So I'd like to know, what is your experience with financial modelling? Have you never done any modelling before? Are you prepared some basic models, or are you maybe you build models sometimes, or is it part of your everyday job? So it's just interesting to see who we've got here. Okay, we've got some people, a bit of a mix. So some people are doing it all day, every day. Okay. So some people have, prepared some basic models in the past for most people. Interesting. Okay. Good. All right, so I wanted to go back to that first question of the definition of financial modelling, and I think a lot of people said forecasting, historicals, scenarios. I do find, and a lot of people said lots of Excel. Is it just a complex spreadsheet? I mean, basically, yes, that is pretty much all a financial model is a complex spreadsheet, but often it contains a lot more than just a typical spreadsheet. Does it need to be a full set of financial statements? Most financial models contain a P&L, a cash flow, and a balance sheet, but not always. Sometimes it might just be cash flow, or it might just be a profitability analysis. So really, a financial model could be just about anything, as long as it has inputs and outputs. And that's what we'll be talking about today. My definition of a financial model is that it's a tool that's usually in Excel, in fact, nearly always in Excel, that displays possible solutions to a real world financial problem. So usually when you go to build a financial model, you have a problem that you need to solve. So you want to know, like, you know, how much are we going to make from this product, or should we expand into this area, that sort of thing. And then you would build a financial model to get the answers to that question. But it's important to remember that a financial model is not the real world. It is a construct that represents the real world. And just because it says that something is going to happen in the financial model, of course, it's really just a representation of the real world. So feel free to let me know if you have any comments about that. You know, it's certainly something that I know a lot of modelers feel quite passionately about, the definition of financial modelling, and people often have slightly different interpretations. So let me know if you have that. But just a couple of subtle differences between an Excel spreadsheet and a financial model. A spreadsheet is a catch-all term. So a spreadsheet could be just about anything. A spreadsheet could just be a list of telephone numbers or a whole lot of data. We often find, you know, when you're using Power Pivot, Power Query, or Power BI, what we're analysing is just a dump of information, and I do not think we could call that a financial model. So a financial model has to have a bit more of a structure. You've got your assumptions, your inputs, your outputs, and it's usually quite strictly laid out. So it's one of the things that we'll talk about with financial modelling best practice is that it does needs to have it very clearly laid out. What is an input and what is an output? That's absolutely critical. A financial model definitely should be dynamic. So you change the inputs and the outputs change. If that doesn't happen, then it's not a model. It's just a dump of data. And then you would always have relationships between those variables. So, you know, you change the inputs and you would see that change flow throughout the model. It's almost always looking into the future. I know that sometimes we often build reports that are backwards looking. Are they financial models? Yeah, I mean, as long as they have those sort of inputs and outputs, if they're just, you know, standalone reports, then they're not a financial model. But as long as they have some kind of dynamic nature to them, usually you'd have perhaps, with most management reports anyway, you perhaps have your actuals for the historical, and then the model would use those historical numbers to forecast out into the future. And of course, they do contain hypothetical outcomes. So we'll talk a bit about scenario analysis and sensitivity analysis. So, you know, instead of just having historical data, a financial model would contain, you know, basically the whole point of being able to build a financial model is so that you can have, you know, what would happen if we did this, or what would happen if we did that. I mean, that's really the whole point. So what I'm planning to cover with you today is sort of three areas. So we'll go into tips, tricks for financial modelling best practice, first of all. Then we'll get into strategies to reduce error. A lot of best practice is about reducing error. You know, if you're not, I'm sure if you've been using Excel for any period of time, you know just how easy it is to have a mistake happen. And then lastly, we'll get into scenario sensitivities and what if analysis, because that's really important for financial modelling. So today's not going to be an overly technical session. It's more sort of overall sort of best practice do's and don'ts for financial modelling, although some of the techniques I will sort of demonstrate a little. So let's jump. Yeah.
We have a question from Brent, and it's a question around your definition of financial modeling.
Okay.
Are all models that are built, are they all bespoke models?
Yeah, good question. Mine generally are, but I know that there are some tools that you can use that will build a model really, really quickly. Most models are bespoke. You know, it's very difficult to reuse models. I don't know if anyone's tried, but I'm actually working on a model at the moment where it's a model that's been built by consultants, and they're trying to use it for something else. So it was a model built for labor resourcing requirements, and it's huge and it does a massive amount of stuff. But they're trying to use it for one particular requirement, and it works, but it's so complex that nobody understands it. So that's the problem with reusing models that already exists. So yeah, most models are bespoke. I know there are, I don't know if you've seen, there's some places like Eloquence, I know, does sell models. So you can, people will build models and then you can buy them as templates. I've never really been successful with doing that. You can certainly reuse parts of models, but yeah, most models are bespoke, unless, of course, what you're doing is if you're reusing, you can reuse a model if it's the same, if it's exactly the same structure and you're just modeling it for a different department, for example, then you can, often with budgeting, for example, you might have one model and then you would repeat it for a load of different departments, and that's something that you would reuse. And certainly if you build the model in a good way, you can reuse it year after year, absolutely. But most of the time it's been built specifically for that purpose. So I hope that answers your question, Brent. Anything else, Ken?
Nope, not at this point. All I say is I agree with you. I can't even imagine trying to buy a model template from someone else that would actually work for the weird ways I do business. Can't even imagine. Everything's custom for me. So
I think it's sometimes it works, but often it's a false economy. So you spend more time trying to understand the model that someone else built when it would have been easier just to start from scratch. So
yeah. Absolutely.
So let's jump into best practice. In fact, best practice is so important that I've dedicated a chapter to best practice in each of my books, and that is the new. So it's now, instead of being a purple cover, it's now going to be a green cover, which is very exciting. So it comes out in January, just in case I didn't mention that. It's going to come out the second edition. So yeah. The best practices, so there's basically 6 points that I wanted to go through. Number one is documentation of assumptions. So that is really, really important. So I just find it really terrifying. I don't know if you guys have ever been in this situation, but when people say, oh, we're going to go ahead with this multi-million-dollar project because the financial model says that we're going to make all this money. And it's really quite scary because you're like, well, based on what? Like, did you check the model? Like, what? People have this kind of blind faith in a financial model. It sort of sounds, it's a financial model and it must be accurate. Not necessarily. So that's why you cannot use the results of a financial model unless you validated the inputs. So making absolutely really, really crystal clear what those assumptions are, because it really is garbage in and garbage out. And just in terms of, from a technical perspective, documenting assumptions. So, there's quite a few different ways of doing that. So I'll just, I might just jump over into Excel now. There we go. And so there's they've changed it. These red triangle comments used to be called comments. They're now called notes. And these in 365, these are now called comments. And they've really improved this so much. You can have these threaded comments, which is great. So that's one way of documenting the assumptions in a model. I'm not a huge fan of those. I sort of find they're a bit sort of you don't see them unless you hover over it, and same sort of thing with that. I actually quite like these data validation comments. So you don't see the comments. So you've got your model, everything's fine, and then you click on this, and you see the data validation comment pops up. So it's quite in context, and I'm sure you've used these before. So it's just under data validation. So rather than there's actually no restriction on the cell. I've just put in the input message, and it's just a little warning just to say, make sure that people remember when they're using it. So it's probably more maybe not so much for assumptions, but for documenting and making sure that people remember, or they, don't make mistakes that, when they're entering things. Yeah, next is footnoting. You can, of course, you can go into your footnotes in here, go into these footnotes. I don't know, you don't see them. I don't know if anybody else uses them. I know with the if you sit the Financial Modelling Institute exam, you have to put footnotes in. That's part of the requirements. I've got to say when I sat that exam, it's probably the last time I used a footnote. I don't really use them very much. Probably because modelling is more of a soft thing. You don't really print, certainly not as much as we used to. So if I'm going to use footnotes, I'm probably more likely to use a footnote like this, where you'd have, perhaps use a superscript or something like that, and then just have it like that. And of course, this could be linked. You could make that dynamic, which we'll have a look at in a sec. Of course, you could use hyperlinks. You could put in the source for a URL, or you could just go in and add a link. So we often might put in, a link to another part of the file, or to a different website or something like that. And that's useful if you don't want to have external links, because having external links can cause quite a few problems. So yeah, hyperlinks could be useful. Hard-coded text, so like that, where we've just got, I quite often do that, where you just literally type it in. So there's nothing clever going on there. So you see it straight away. So you open it up and nothing changes. There's nothing, prints out properly. So hard-coded text is fine. Then there's also dynamic text, of course. So that's just using a formula. So just converting hard-coded text into a formula. And the great thing about that, of course, is that it's dynamic and it will change. And the way that I've got this set up is so that if this were, this starts from next year, like that, everything rolls forward. And you don't have to worry about things being out of date. I often find people will document all of their assumptions in a Word document, which is crazy, because the minute you do that, it's going to be out of date. So it's always good to have that. So if we were to, if this were to change to something else, then that will change as well. Everything flows through. So having one single input, having it flow through is really, we'll talk about that as well. So yeah, that was just a couple of technical ways of documenting assumptions. So that's number one on financial modelling best practice, is documentation of assumptions. Was there any questions or comments on that point before we move on?
It doesn't seem to, although I've got a question for you. Is how the heck do you actually convince people to keep this stuff up to date? Or are you actually generally the person that's looking after it, so it's actually your challenge all the way through?
Yeah, I try to, personally, I work for a lot of different companies, and often they'll send a model back and they'll say, I've broken it. But generally, I try to build a model in such a way that they can't break it, so they can, keep it going forward. And I'm not the sort of consultant that wants people to come back to you all the time. So I try to teach people how to maintain it, and that way they can keep it going forward. And they know, like, not to make changes to formulas and not to type over formulas, that sort of thing. But yeah, they don't always, and sometimes they break it and then they send it back to me, but that's okay. So number 2, use consistent formulas. So this is Excel 101, but having that mixed cell referencing, so you have one single formula all the way across and all the way down, is absolutely critical from an audit perspective as well. So let me show you what I mean. So like just here, like, for example, I'm sure you guys would do this without even realising it, but you may not realise how important it is, so that, if you ever get your financial model audited, I'm not talking about a finance audit of the finance department, I'm talking about an audit of your financial model. So it's really important that you have as few unique formulas as possible. So when someone tries to audit the model, they will try to, one of the things they look for is how many unique formulas are in the model, and that is counted as one single formula, even though it's 9 different cells, but you might have, 60 months across and thousands of rows down. And if you follow this technique, you have one single formula all the way across and down. So that is, wherever possible, try to have consistency of formulas. So that's probably the most common way of doing it, to just use your mixed referencing. So just, getting your dollar signs in the right place. If you're using 365, you might use dynamic arrays where you have one single formula that copies across. I don't know about you guys, but I think that's a little bit confusing. I'd still probably prefer to do it the first way. Using dynamic arrays is they're great, but doing it like that I don't think is fantastic. Using named ranges, so I've gone in and created interest rate 1, interest rate 2, interest rate 3, and if you were to try to use a formula there and you can't then copy it across, you have to go into interest rate 2, interest rate 3. That is 3 separate formulas. So when I want to copy that across, Control C across like that, of course it's not going to work. So so using a named range is not great. If you are going to use a named range, of course, you could use a named range like that. So the name that I've used for interest is like that, and the name that I've used for borrowing is like that. So I've just used, but I don't know. I don't think there's a huge amount of benefit in doing it that way. I know it's kind of easy to read using a named range, but I think it's more work, really. And then if you want to extend it, you've got to sort of go in and edit the name. I don't know. I'd still prefer to do it this way. I think that's probably the simplest. I generally just go for the, I think in any sort of financial models, you can over-engineer things really, really quickly and easily. So always try to go for the simplest solution. And I think that's probably the simplest solution, definitely.
I think that makes a great segue into our next question, actually. Is the modeling community receptive to let and lambdas?
Yeah, absolutely. Once we get, the problem is lots of people haven't got access to it yet. They're great.
Do you feel that way about lambdas? I mean, I certainly do about the let function. I think the let function is absolutely brilliant, but lambdas terrify me because there's not really a lot of tools to understand them today.
Yeah, actually, to be honest, I haven't had a need to use Lambda yet. I use let a lot, not so much Lambda, and I haven't quite got my head around it yet, so I haven't used it. Also, I don't think everyone's got access to it yet. Is that right? I know.
No, lambdas are still, I think, gated behind some of the beta stuff. Let, I believe, is out there for everybody, at least on Office 365.
Yeah.
That one's been around for a while.
Using it, yeah. I guess also, as a consultant, you want to make sure that something is completely mainstream before you start using it, because nothing worse than, the first question you want to ask is what version are you using, and you don't want to, even if you use it just an X lookup and then find that it doesn't work for them. So you want to sort of make sure that the technique is used by everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Next question, and I'm going to paraphrase this one just a little bit here, but what about financial modeling using DAX? Is that something that you've seen a lot of, or no?
No? No. I mean, if it's if it's appropriate, I haven't I haven't used that a lot. If it's necessary. Most financial models are just built using ordinary Excel. If necessary, you'll use the data model and then get into DAX. You're sort of getting into that, I suppose. A lot of people find it difficult to read and to use. And Power BI, we don't do a lot of, although it is possible to build a financial model in Power BI, but generally you would only go to Power BI if you want to have the visuals, if you're specifically wanting to build a dashboard that you can share with other people. So, how about you, Ken? Have you built any models with DAX?
My life revolves around working with Power Query and Power Pivot. So yes, I mean, I certainly have. And
what about for modeling?
For financial forecasting. I mean, I did an entire housing development for a 21-year build out that required a ton of the stuff. I mean, it was, really, really interesting. And I mean, I mixed some Excel in with it as well, but I'm laughing right now because Brent's put in a comment, he says, DAX with cube values are a great way to anger your internal auditors. And, I generally tend to agree with that, but at the same time, I mean, I would say that maybe your internal auditors need to learn about those technologies because sometimes they are really, really useful. I mean, the model that I built for this thing, I mean, and this kind of goes back actually to your question a little bit earlier, Henry, about DAX promoting consistent formulas, is that with DAX, you have no choice but to use consistent formulas because that's the way DAX works for the most part. But,
exactly.
you know, it is a different skill set. But yeah, I mean, the thing I was building was a 21-year forecast. And I mean, it was great. And I built the previous one using Excel formulas. The amount of unique Excel formulas I had to do what I could do with DAX was insanely different. So, you know, I would, yes, it's certainly possible. It just takes a slightly different skill set. So.
Yeah, certainly. And yeah, it's certainly a great skill to have. And you get into that, that's a fine line between using something that is because it's the best tool, or do you not use it because nobody knows how to use it? But then if you don't use it, then nobody will ever know how to use it. So you have to sort of use stuff because so as a modeler, you have to choose the tool that's going to be the best solution for the outcome that's required. But if someone has specifically said, keep it simple, I need to be able to run this myself, then I probably would, you know, try not to make it too complex.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And I think that actually ties into a comment that Angela's made here about financial modeling on PCs and Macs mixed environments. You get into that kind of a world, and it's hugely problematic, as he says. I mean, you can't use DAX. You got to be in regular.
Yeah, exactly. And, it's frustrating. I built a beautiful dashboard for someone once, and then realized that I'd sort of inadvertently tapped into the data model, and it wouldn't run for the client. So yeah,
that's no good.
Something to be careful of for sure. So on to the next one, linking rather than hard coding. So, you know, having the inputs change and the outputs, if your inputs change, the outputs change it. But if you haven't linked, of course, that's not going to happen. So external files are generally a bad idea. But one of the best practice things that you might have noticed in the models that I've shown is having a different color and a different format for the inputs and the outputs. And that's something I think certainly my clients get used to. So, for example, you know, here you can see that this is a formula. This is a formula because of the way that it's been formatted. And that I thought was a formula. No, it's not a formula. And that's a variable. So I've just used a style. So, of course, you could just use your inputs like that, which I find a little bit leery. So I've kind of adjusted it just a little bit so that if something were to change, it will just flow through. So if we say our cost of capital is 9%, so everything has linked to that one single cell. So that flows all the way through. So that my MPV will change. And then, of course, I've got my title of my chart will automatically change as well. So let me make that a little bit smaller so you can see. So if that changes back to 8%, you can see the title of the chart will change because you can't have formulas inside a chart title, but you would have this change and then that would dynamically change the output as well. So making sure that everything links, so not having hard coding is an important part of financial modelling best practice, and to, of course, make it really clear what is an input and what is an output, not just for you, but for your users as well. And we often put a legend or a sort of style so we can see, you know, what does it mean when you see different formatting. So, for example, the sort of corkscrew cash flow forecast that you might see in a lot of financial models. And what I often see is you have your opening cash links down to your cash at the end, which should link up to your closing, which then links down to your opening, down to your closing. And what we often see, this surplus or deficit, this financing, these here should be dynamic, and they're often not. We often find people when they are managing their cash flow, they'll be like, oh, I'm a little bit short in this month and I've got to, and they'll often sort of tweak these. And I know it's hard work, But, if you can use some round up formulas, or, formulas that are automated so that, everything just automatically flows through. So having the links is going to make your life so much easier in a financial model. And we've kind of talked about this one a little bit already, but not entering data more than once. So only enter it in one single place, and then always reference that one cell. So for example, you've got inflation, you change that inflation, and then everywhere in the entire model that you talk about inflation, you link back to that same cell. I know it sounds a lot of this stuff is really just common sense. I mean, you would think that would be common sense, but you'd be surprised how often it happens. You have these redundant assumptions that people are, merrily changing away, and then they find that they're not actually driving the model at all, and never use a value within a formula. So, don't sort of hard code values into a cell. You should have so rather than having that number in there, you would have it in a separate cell and then link to that to avoid daisy chaining or spaghetti links and that sort of thing. I think I have an example here. Yeah, entering it once. So like here, for example, this sort of thing where you have a starting date. So if that were to change, so that, that's what I was talking about with reusing a model. So you can often reuse models like that if you build it in such a way that the starting point will dynamically change. I have a lot of clients that don't call me back because they are able to just change the starting date. So if I change that to 2023, everything just flows through from there. So you want to sort of build it in such a way that that you can reuse it and roll forward. And so if you just enter that once and then it flows through. Number 5 is using error checks. So I'm not talking about Excel errors. I'm talking about errors that, we'll talk more about errors shortly, but using error checks. So, my favorite error check is to just say one cell minus the other. So very often in management reporting, for example, that this plus this plus this plus this should be equal to the total. And if it's not, you'd like to know about it. So just some really simple formulas that will alert you to when there's been a problem. And I can't tell you how many times an error check has saved the day, for sure. So, just a really simple example of an error check would be perhaps something like that. So you could actually, that's not as simple. My preferred method would be to just say that cell minus that cell. I actually think that is actually easier. And if you format it using the comma style, you just get a little dash like that. And you just it's so simple to build. If you prefer to see the word okay or something like that, but then, you can get a false error sometimes. So Excel, truncates at a certain number of decimal places. And so sometimes if you'd say, if that's equal to, you can get it might be 0.00 something out. So we use the absolute value of the difference between the two. Something like that.
Danielle, I've got a quick question from Charlie, which actually goes back to a previous one. He was actually looking for the definition of spaghetti links.
Of what, sorry? Spaghetti links.
Spaghetti links.
Yeah. Spaghetti links would be, like this, for example. So this links to that, So that's linking to there. And then this one links to there. And then, if we had another one, what we often find is that people link this one to here, and then they link this one to here. So you end up with this links to that, and then that links to that, and then that links to that. So that's what we mean by a spaghetti link or a daisy chain. And that's not a great practice, because if somebody was to go, often you might say, well, actually, as you're building it, I don't need that block of data anymore. Just get rid of it. And then everything messes up. Whereas if you'd have, linked it to the source, always link it to there, and then that links to the source, then if you were to delete a block of data, it's not going to mess things up. So that's what I mean by trying to avoid. So always trying to link back to the original source wherever possible. That's what I mean by that.
I always feel that it always looks awesome when you can click on a cell and use trace dependence, and it looks like Spider-Man just shot across your spreadsheet, right? Then you know you've done it right.
And it just makes it easier for someone auditing it or validating it to, rather than for them having to trace back and trace back and trace back and then, where did that come from? It's so much easier if you can just link to the source in the first place. And as a mod, so some of these things, as the modeler building it, you're going to make it easier for the next person and for yourself. It's not just for others. Often you come to a model 6 months later and you go like, what the heck did I do there? Whereas if you build it in a way that is well structured and documented and neat and tidy, it's just going to make your life easier using it, and also someone else. You want your model to be able to speak for you after you've moved on to bigger and better things. So if you're not around anymore, you want your model to sort of be a testament to your work. So that's why structure is so important.
It's a shame that when you create a daisy chain link, so I mean, you've got something that points to F2, and then you make another one that points to the cell that does that. It's a shame that Excel doesn't actually pop up and say, hey, you're creating a daisy chain. Do you want me to point it back to the original? That would be really nice. We should suggest that as a feature.
Yeah, it would. Yeah, good suggestion. Yeah. Okay. We'll talk a bit more about error checks later. But the last point of financial modelling best practice is formatting and labelling. And it's, not really a technical thing, but just, as you're modelling, one of the biggest mistakes in financial modelling is mixing units. So, mixing up different metrics versus imperial, or kilometers versus meters, or something like that, or mixing up currencies is really common. So make it absolutely clear what those what the units are. We often say to have a specific column or a specific row that tells you what the units are, to make that super clear, and using symbols. If you don't want to format it like that, just make sure that it's in the heading so that people absolutely know what currency you're talking about or what unit of measurement, and labeling is really important there. So that's it for best practice, the first part, and we're going to jump in next to some technical strategies to reduce error. But were there any questions or any comments before we move on?
Henry actually just threw in a comment that he thinks that it would actually be better than my suggestion of repointing the links just to relink when the middle cell is deleted. I don't know that I actually agree with that, but I mean, it would be a kind of a cool feature. I think we've probably all received a spreadsheet that somebody saved with a ref error and sent it to us and asked us to fix it, which is never a good thing. But how you would ever do that, I have no idea. I mean, I guess unless you were to delete it and said, hey, precedence.
Yeah, what did he suggest?
Well, he said it would be better if it could relink the cell. So I guess the only way I can think that would happen is if you deleted a cell that was in the middle of a daisy chain, it would have to actually repoint the later one before it nuked the original. Maybe that would be better. I don't know. I still think it'd be better to treat it right up front, but that's just me.
Refs are horrible, aren't they? Because you don't know because usually it means that it's been deleted, and it's very hard to find what it was supposed to be in the first place.
Well, yeah, without the logic there, you're kind of in tough.
So was there anything else before we move on to errors?
That's it for now.
Great. So I mean, there's more types of error, but really the main types of errors in financial models are formula errors, which are probably the most embarrassing. If you let a formula error slip through in your model and someone else finds it, is quite mortifying and rather career damaging if that happens. So they're the easiest to make but the easiest to fix. So we'll look at some ways to reduce that or to stop that from happening. The second one is a little bit harder, is incorrect assumptions or inputs, and that's the sort of thing that a model audit would not pick up, because you need to test those assumptions. So we'll look at some ways of doing that. And logic error, that's even harder. Like how just the logic in how the model has been built, and that's often because of the industry. Perhaps people don't understand the industry, or they don't understand how the product or the particular thing that you're modelling actually works. So that can be quite difficult to identify. So I'm going to refer to chapter 13 of this book, where I've gone through 10 strategies to reduce errors. So number one is using the enter key. So this, I find the number one line of defence against error is to use the enter key, look at the number, does it look right? Does it look sensible? So for example, if you've finished editing a formula and you click somewhere, don't do that. Don't look. So look at the formula, hit the enter key. Is that what you intended it to be? Does it look right? So do a bit of a sense check, because what we often find is, you might have accidentally clicked there and then you click somewhere else. Let's say if I were to click there, and then it'll just pick that up and then hit enter, and you can see I've got the little flag there, but you might inadvertently, I often see people do that, and then they kind of, move off the page, and then they click somewhere else, and then they kind of don't even look at what it was. So using the enter key, does it look right? Does it look sensible? Copy it across and down. Do a bit of a spot check using your F2. Is it picking up the right cells? Yep. That's something that can really reduce the possibility for error for sure. Check your work. So after you hit the enter key, look at the formula. Does that value look correct? After you've checked it 3 times, check it again. And after you've checked it again, have someone else check it. I used to have a bit of a deal with one of my colleagues, and I'd say, look, before we send off our models, let's just check each other's models, because it's pretty boring checking somebody else's models. It's much more fun to be building your own models when the numbers are flying, and it's all really fun, but actually going through and checking and auditing somebody else's model can be pretty boring. So if you sort of do it for each other, can help. And she used to question me about the model, and I would go through and explain how it worked, and she would ask questions perhaps that I wasn't expecting, and that would help me to prepare for the questions that I might get about the model. So that's a technique that you might employ. The documentation and the validation of assumptions, clearly lay out and document those assumptions will help in the future. So when people are using the model, they'll be able to see exactly what those assumptions were that had been used. We often would build a flowchart, perhaps, to sort of, I'm doing this at the moment for a model that I'm building, to actually sort of, document this links to this, and then this, to actually sort of show what the model is doing. That can sort of identify logic errors. Another one that can sort of help with the inputs, if the assumptions are wrong, is to do some stress testing. So putting some sort of crazy numbers in, like price. If price was 0, I mean, obviously you're not going to sell your product for 0, but if the price was 0, you would expect that revenue would be 0. Or what about if we doubled our head count? Would you find that the salary costs have doubled as well? That sort of thing can really, just to sort of stress test. And people often don't put aside enough time for this. You've spent, all this time, you're always under pressure, the time constraints of getting the model out, and you don't leave enough time for just checking and testing and just making sure that everything is working. It's not the sexy part of modelling, this kind of checking and testing afterwards, and documentation as well. People, we'll leave that to the end, and you're not going to be interested. When the model is done, you're going to be so exhausted and you just want to get it off. So make sure that you document as you go, and that you build these checks and test it before you move on. When you're in a hurry, especially when you're in a hurry, that's when you really need to sort of stop and take a minute, because you're more likely to make mistakes when you're in a hurry. So a couple other examples of stress testing: doubling head count, the growth, change it to 0. Charting, sometimes the old F11 shortcut that will give you an instant chart. I often will create a whole lot of charts in a model that I may not even show anybody, but if I can see, this versus this, doing a combo chart with 2 axes or something like that, and you can sort of see visually something that you're like, hang on, why does that do that? And it can help you to sort of flush out any sort of anomalies or explain why something's behaving in a certain way. So stress testing, but also scenarios and particularly sensitivity analysis. So sensitivity is where you tweak one possible input and see how that changes. We'll talk a little more about scenarios in a minute. Take note of Excel errors. So I actually don't mind these errors. I would prefer to see an error that looks like this. These errors should be actually helpful, except for the ref. The ref's never helpful. It means you've deleted something that no longer exists. But generally, I would much rather see an error. I very rarely use that if error, or sometimes, yeah, I think I used in one of the examples I just showed you. Because if you use the if error, it will suppress the error that perhaps you want to see. So if somebody were to enter an invalid data in your lookup table or something and it's not there anymore, you want to see that. You want to be able to get to the bottom and fix that. So you should take note of the Excel errors. So for example, we'll come back to the scenario like this, the new spill error, for example. So you might have if you were to use one of the new formulas, the unique, which is one of my favorites, and you were to want to do a list there, you can see that this is in the way of what it's trying to create. So get rid of it there, and you can see that it will automatically pop up. So those errors are there to help you. Circular references are perhaps another. Yeah, not necessarily there to help you. I am of the opinion that you should not have a circular reference in a model. I know it's a bit of a point of contention amongst quite a few financial modelers, but in my opinion, if you see a circular reference, you should stop whatever you are doing and just stop, undo, close without saving, whatever you have to do to get rid of that circular reference. I don't know what your opinion is on this, Ken, but I know that a lot of financial models do allow circular references. I know with the Financial Modelling Institute exams, that is actually an allowed option, is to allow the circular reference. So in the exam is, you've got, and it's a pretty common thing in a financial model where you've got your interest drives your profit and your profit drives your funding and your funding drives your cash flow and your cash flow drives your borrowings and your borrowings drives your interest and your interest drives your profitability and your profitability drives your cash flow, and you end up with a circular reference. And that's a pretty common problem in financial models. Personally, I try to sort of get around it mathematically or in a way that doesn't, or even use a macro to break that circular reference. What's your opinion on that, Ken? Have you come across that?
Circular references hurt my head. No, I haven't. Yes. Every time I run in with one of those things, I go and destroy it immediately, and I rebuild the thing so that I don't end up with a circular reference. I just, and it's not even about whether or not I actually can get myself to the point of understanding. It's about the fact that if I hand it to someone else, they can't. And that's I always joke that my favorite thing to do with work is delegate it to someone else. And if you build something that's too complicated for them to understand, it comes back to you. And that's not the goal, right?
Yes.
So, but hey, I actually wanted to just sort of interject with a question too, and I'd like to go back to the error stuff a little bit, and your comment on how you don't use the if error statement and whatnot. I don't use if error either. Yeah. Okay, fair enough. I don't generally use if error either, but I will actually specifically go and target things like if NA or specifically go and target errors. And my philosophy is, you will never see a divide by zero error in my spreadsheet, because to me that makes me feel like I haven't done my job to be able to properly guard against it. It should come back with a zero, or it should come back with a message or something else, and I have the ability to change it. But do you leave like hash error messages in your models? I can't stand. I want to get rid of it.
I think it looks incomplete.
Yes.
And if you see an error, you need to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah.
So that's what the purpose of the error is. There's a reason for it, because somebody's, and so you'd say if the whatever you're trying to divide by is zero, then give me something else. So Whereas if you use I use the if error back here, was back on this one, because I was using an offset and the offset was going off the page. So we end up with an error, but I could have done another way. So in that case, I did use an if error. So I do use it sometimes.
Yeah, my philosophy on working with these, and I mean, there's no right and no wrong answers. My philosophy on this one though is I try to avoid if error at all possible, because if error will mask a ref error, which is one of the things that you mentioned. So for me, I want to make sure that any error handling that I'm doing is targeted so that I don't accidentally mask that one, because if you see it hashed ref, you need to stop right before you save. Right, that's
well, except for an offset where you kind of need to have an off. Because it's you want to do 6 months and it's going that way, and
it's one of those where there's no other choice. I mean, that's where I would sort of run it backwards. But I'm always leery of that, because I mean I've seen that happen before, where somebody goes and deletes the data table and suddenly everything still looks fine, and you're like, wait, that's not right. Yeah, not good. Not a good scene.
Yeah. So moving on to. Back onto error checks, and a strategy for reducing error checks, which is probably not going to help you as you're building the model, but it's certainly going to help somebody using the model in the future. And a good financial modeler should always be looking for opportunities. So if you know that this should be equal to that, then build an error check, when you think of it, and that will it should not replace good modeling practice. But if you perhaps have a certain perhaps sometimes I do a summary of all of the error checks throughout the entire model, particularly if it's a model that's being used by other people. And then I get it back later and I'm like, what the heck did they do? And using this, I can sort of trace back and see where the errors have popped up, where I can see that people have entered data that's invalid or that sort of thing. Pay attention to those error checks. Don't ignore them. Don't move on until they're actually fixed. You can use conditional formatting if you want to, but certainly build those error checks as you go, and make sure that they're always kept up to date. So those were some of the 10 strategies to reduce errors.
Danielle, how far do you take your error checking structure? Like, do you set up your error checks so that you're checking an individual worksheet? Do you have a table that's at the top of each worksheet that links back to the other sheets so you can see if something goes wrong on one sheet that it's blown up the entire model? How far do you take it?
Yeah, I would do it like this, where you've got an error check here, and then I would perhaps have, or even an error check column. So all of the error checks are there, and then at the top of the column, you would do a count of, whatever your flag is. If it's not 0, so you'd say if sum is not 0, then there's an error. So you can see straight away there might be thousands of error checks, but you can see in the corner that that's my one cell that's going to show it. And then you might have that throughout the entire model, and then you might have one sort of summary where not if I wouldn't do that in every model, but often I might have one single cell where you'll see it straight away that there is an error somewhere in this model, but you need to build it in that way.
Fair enough. Brent's also asked a question. He says, I saw an offset there. He says, how small should our models be to be when we're using volatile functions? Offset's
not a volatile function, is it? I don't think
it is.
I'm not a big. Sorry.
My answer to that is, as soon as it starts slowing down, you've overdone it. So now wind it back, stop, right? But I don't think there's a rule that I've ever really worked with.
Yeah. I mean, one thing to remember, of course, is if you use a volatile function like today or rand between or something like that, where it's going to. That's like a true volatile, where it's going to be that certainly is constantly going to be calculating. So again, you would have, so rather than using a today formula within your formula, you would have one single cell that refers to today's date. And if you wanted to say, anything that's in the past, give me this, otherwise give me that, then rather than using the today formula within all of the formulas, you would have one single cell with today and then refer to that. And that's certainly going to reduce the calculation speed. I think the question though was about, where was it? This one, the offset. Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of the offset, only because it's hard to audit and hard for others to follow. I don't know that it uses more memory, or I haven't discovered that. I may be wrong on that. As Ken says, if it slows it down, stop using it. So we just try not to sort of have too much. Try to keep it as simple and as small as possible. So that was just another example of an error check. So where you've got some phasing, often with budgeting, for example, you might want to put in some seasonality, and you want to make sure that that adds up to 12. So you're saying phasing is January is a lower month, so it's 80%. 1 is average, so that's your standard. And then if you sort of do this phasing, it's going to sort of change over time. So we use a formula that's going to divide it by 12 and then multiply it by our phasing. So you want to make sure that you've got your total amount there is 3053, and you want to make sure that as it gets phased out over the 12 months, you want to make sure, and that's just something to make sure. That's an example of where you would definitely use an error check. So any other questions or comments on that?
No, just one from Henry that he says today and now cause issues when you have a model being used or using global units when local time causes difference in aging and reports. Yeah, it definitely does. Excel needs UTC time functions for that reason. Power BI has them, although I gotta be honest, even that's a nightmare when you're trying to work across multiple time zones. But yeah, it's a challenging problem.
Yeah. So lastly, let's jump into scenarios and sensitivities and what if analysis, because that's really, if you build, a lot of these best practices are to reduce error, but also so that you can easily build scenarios and sensitivities, because that's really the whole point of modelling. Going back to the definition of a financial model, you're looking at the past and you're often wanting to predict the future and see what could potentially happen in the future. But if you build it in such a way that you can build scenarios quite easily. So if we say, what would happen if we did this, or what would happen if that, or what would happen if our borders open, what would happen if the borders remain closed, that sort of thing you want to build scenarios around. But, a bit of a difference between sensitivities, scenarios, and what if analysis. So sensitivities is where you tweak one or two input variables independent of each other. So, it would be like, what would happen if inflation was to go up? Or what would happen if our interest rate changed, that sort of thing. You'd see one single variable, whereas scenarios would be like a whole raft of things could happen. This goes up, this goes down, and there might be some interdependencies between each of those. Whereas what if analysis, so, in the Excel's got your sort of what if analysis tab here. So it kind of, refers to, and we often use the goal seek as well. So you've got, a number of tools that are in there. So scenarios, might be something like this, where you've got, I've used a data validation drop down, change the drop down, and then all the numbers change. So you can see that if I were to change that to base case, you can see that's 14%, whereas if I change it to worst case, so it's just that's a really common method of scenario analysis, just creating a drop-down box and manually seeing it change from one to the other. So that's probably the most common method of scenario analysis. So that's using a combo drop-down box. Alternatively, of course, you could use a data validation drop-down box instead, which works in exactly the same way. I think it's easier to build. Of course, the formula is going to be slightly different, so you might use a sum or a lookup or something like that. Whereas if you were using a combo, your formula would be, something perhaps a little bit different. Combos can be quite, just take a little bit longer to build, of course, but I think they're sort of easy for the user. So when we see a drop-down box, you're like, yeah, there's a drop-down box. I know what to do when I see a drop-down box. Whereas with the data validation, you come along and you're like, what do I do? Oh, drop-down box. Oh, right, there it is. So I think sometimes the combo box might be a better solution if you've got other people using it, but it's just a different method. But just the different, there's lots of different tools in Excel that you can use for scenarios, and we've sort of looked at the easy or the simplest, the most commonly used. What we don't do, what I see a lot of people do, is you finish the financial model and you call it base case scenario, and then you change all the numbers and you save another copy and call it best case scenario. And then you change all the numbers again and save another copy and call it worst case scenario. So you end up with multiple versions of the same model, and that is not a very smart way of building scenarios in a model. You're best off to have one single model and then just be able to build scenarios within it. And having that sort of manual scenario selection is just easy to build and easy for others to follow. That's sort of a pretty probably majority of the scenarios that I build using that. There's also something called the scenario manager, which is not really that helpful. I don't use it very much, but it's there. There's data tables. So data tables are great, more for sensitivity. So for example, so that's an example of a data table. I'm sure you've used those before. So, if you were to, you can see there, I've got a payment formula. So that's just using a loan calculation. So if you were to borrow this amount at this rate, this is what your monthly repayment is. But then if you wanted to do sensitivities on it, so what if it was 6%? Okay. So you would sort of tweak it. So rather than have to go through and manually enter all of the inputs, you can run a data table that's going to show all of them simultaneously. And this is something that we do a lot of in financial models. And if you build it, and this is why a lot of the things that we were talking about with best practice are so important, because if you don't structure the model where you've got hard-coded inputs linking to the outputs, then the data table is simply not going to work, or the drop or any of the scenario techniques that we've talked about are not going to work. So if we go into the data table like that, column input cell, interest rate, and that's going to give us all of the possible outcomes. Get my calculation to run. It's going to show them all simultaneously in a single table. And similarly with this one, so you would run again, run a data table like that. Of course, it's a type of array formula, so you can tell because of the curly brackets. So if you wanted to delete, you can't change part of the data table. So to get rid of it, you need to highlight the whole lot and delete. So to rebuild that data table, you need to highlight, like the old array formulas before dynamic arrays came in. You had to highlight the whole lot first. Go data table, row input cell is term of the loan, because that's designed in a row, and the column input cell is the interest rate, like that. Okay, I must have my calculation turned off. So I can make these files. I've got some instructions there. If people are interested, I can make these files available to people if you guys want to see how they work. So goal seek, I'm sure you've used. So you just have a goal seek, so you know what the input is, and you know what the output is that you want, and you change the input to such that it is the same as the output that you want. So that's a pretty common one. Often we find that they can be a little bit complicated for users, because they're like, which one's the input, which one's the output? So often we'd perhaps create a little macro button or something so that it will just automatically run for you. And then lastly is Monte Carlo simulation, which is a more complex way, and we often could do that in Excel using data tables. So stochastic simulations is when you're testing a variable, thousands and thousands of times, and seeing, what the possible outcomes could be based on the constraints of the model. So you sort of build the model first, and then say, how much can this model change if I were to test to run random variables against a data table, multiple times. So any comments or questions about those?
We've got one question from Stanley, who says he'd like to see how data tables are actually used. Do you have an example that's cooked up that's easy for that?
Yeah, well, this is a fairly sort of simple example, but it doesn't have to be as simple as this. I often have models that, you might have like, you do have to have the inputs or the original inputs and the data table on the same tab, but you can have it run through, multiple calculations. That works really well. Let me see if I've got another example there. So there's another example of that same one there. So you see what the profit margin is, and you can see all the potential outcomes. So rather than having to do the drop down, so change one there, so you see one at a time, whereas with a data table, you see everything in one single view. So that's kind of the difference between doing a scenario where you're looking at best case, base case, worst case, one at a time versus a data table. So there's lots of use cases for
now the questions are pouring in too. So Brent says that he's got lots of uses for data tables in the net present value space. That makes sense to me. And Henry's asking, can you have more than 2 dimensions for a data table?
No, I wish. No, you have to sort of just do multiple. Often I'll do one. So you do one like that, and then you might have like, tons of different variables next to each other. So that's a way of doing it. But no, I mean, it's only 2 variables. So that's a limitation of a data table, having 2 inputs and 1 single output.
Data tables, not data cubes.
No, yes.
There we go. I think that's it for questions so far.
Okay. So just as we talked about, the manual scenario analysis is great because it's easy to build and easy to understand, and you can have like a whole lot of inputs and outputs. So you do drop down and then you see the entire model. But the problem or the disadvantages of the manual where you're doing the drop down is you can only look at one at a time. So it makes it quite difficult to compare scenarios side by side. So often, when you finished your financial model, you want to be able to show the outputs of the different scenarios. So often, this is your presentation that you have to give. So you want to be able to show that the comparison. So it's quite hard to do that, side by side. Whereas the data table is great because you can see them all side by side, but they can be a bit tricky to build. The inputs and outputs can be on the same, do have to be on the same page, and there can only be 1 or 2 variables. It can also slow down your calculation if you have lots and lots of data tables. So go easy if you're going to use data tables. But as with any sort of financial models, remember that there can be only one outcome and it will be wrong. Don't think that because the financial model says that the forecast is going to be this, for sure that it's going to be wrong. So it's really just the financial model is a representation of reality. It's not, it's a construct that represents possible realities which may happen in the future, but it's most certainly going to be wrong. So that's just a couple of things as skills that we've kind of talked about. So firstly is you do need to be pretty good at Excel. So that's number 1. You need to have industry knowledge, so understand what it is that you're modeling. Having some accounting and finance knowledge is certainly helpful. What's the NPV? What is how to build a balance sheet? That's not straightforward. Business knowledge, design skills. Making it neat and tidy and laying it out properly. That can be quite hard. Is sort of making it logical. I've often seen models that are just higgledy-piggledy all over the place. So making it neatly and well designed, communication, language, being able to actually present the model at the end. They often want to hear from you. Numeracy skills, of course, and logic. So ability to think logically is quite important. So it is a absolutely wonderful career. It's just a fantastic skill to have. You can be a financial modeler. There's not a huge number of people who say, like me, I'm a financial modeler. That's my primary role. but often it'll be just simply a skill set within all of your other skills. So, but certainly if you're working in finance and you're building models, you should definitely have it on your CV. It's it's a fantastic skill to have, and certainly something that's gained a lot of popularity, certainly for employers, definitely. So, whether you're going to, if you put it on your, put it on your LinkedIn profile, don't exaggerate. Make sure that you know what financial modelling is and that you can say, yes, I have done it. Just because you've been on a financial modelling training course doesn't mean you're a financial modeller. Make sure that you've actually done it in your work. So, be able to, if you put it on your CV, you want to be able to give example of practical application of those financial models in everyday work. And if you don't have the opportunity to do that, try and make some opportunities to apply your modelling skills. So one of the best places, I think, to improve your skills is the Financial Modelling World Cup. So that is something that is run every month, or I think next year they're going to go into every second month, where it's like 15 US, I think it is, to sign up. And every month they sort of give you financial models and Excel problems. They're hard, they're really hard. And the Financial Modelling World Cup, FMWC Open, is on at the moment. So it's not just financial modelling, it's about Excel skills. And I'm one of the commentators. And it's going to be streaming on ESPN3, which is just like a minor app of ESPN, but it's very exciting. So we often have like thousands of people watching live. So it's Excel as esports. So, we have people, so there'll be like a couple of hundred people actually competing. And then we have the session that I'm running on Saturday night. So it'll be probably Saturday morning for you guys, maybe. And there's a couple of different tournaments going on for different times of day. So be sure to sort of check those out. So this is one of the links that I sent you earlier, Ken. I don't know if you want to pop that in the chat for people. I can't see the chat.
It is already there. You bet.
Great.
I'd be curious to know if we actually get anybody that goes to try and compete. That'll be
yeah. I mean, so it's a great. Certainly if you compete regularly, it improves your skills. It is really hard, so don't freak out. Like you get 3 cases, and the first time I did it, I didn't even get through 1 case. It's not easy, but. And you can put your name up there on the rankings, or you can not. You can be anonymous, but it's just really good training and a way of improving your skills and also proving your competence as a financial modeller. So I think it's great. The other thing you can do is to become a certified financial modeller, and that's the exam that I mentioned. So you have to build a full financial model within 4 hours. Which is not a difficult financial model, but building it within 4 hours is difficult. So you need to build a P&L cash flow balance sheet. You need to build a debt schedule with a debt revolver, with cash flow, depreciation waterfall, working capital calculate, quite detailed financial model. It's a virtual exams. So that's something that you might consider. And the other thing I wanted to mention was the virtual meetups that I run. Hopefully Ken is going to be one of our speakers coming up soon for our open meetups. I also run the Women in Financial Modelling meetup group to encourage women, firstly, to compete in the Financial Modelling World Cup, because that's very much a male, Excel smackdown kind of thing. So I really am trying to make it to encourage more women to get into financial modelling, because I think it's a place where there are some fantastic women modellers, but you don't always hear from them. So the meetups are the open meetups are open to everybody, but we also run another group as well. So those are all listed there. We don't have any listed for next year yet. We're just going to have a bit of a break. So in Australia, everything kind of shuts down from about the middle of December until the end of January. So we're all going to have a bit of a break, and then we're going to start from the new year. And the other thing that's coming up is the Global Excel Summit on the 9th to 11th of February. So I'm doing a keynote on, hang on, I've gone blank. I'm doing a masterclass on financial modelling, and then I'm also doing a keynote. I can't recall the topic right now. And you get 10% discount if you use my code. But I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn. It's probably the place that I spend the most of my time. So yeah, that's it. So yeah, any questions that you haven't done just yet? Let me see how I can.
I don't see anybody in there. We're trying to encourage Henry to go and compete in the financial modeling championship. He was fascinated with the Monte Carlo thing and everything else. He seems like the guy that should be there for this group, but he's not committing to us. So. But
yeah,
no, listen.
Well, you can, you don't have to. You don't have to necessarily. Make it public. You can. You can just compete anonymously.
There you go. That's the way to do it. And then you only brag if you do really well, right?
Exactly. I've had a shocking season. I'm not doing very well at all, but my name is up there for all to see. So there you go. I'm just trying to find my keynote. Oh, that's right. A business case. Building a strong business case financial model. That is my keynote for the Global Excel Summit in February.
Cool. There you go. Awesome. I'm not seeing any questions coming in right now, but listen, Danielle, I want to say thanks for that. It's fantastic summary of stuff there. It's interesting. I know for myself, I mean, I've actually created some financial modeling training for people as well. Not having gone through the financial modeling industry, it's nice. I feel quite validated because everything that I actually had in there, you had as well. So that's good. At least it means we're speaking from the same point. So that's cool.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah,
glad to hear it.
Well, I mean, a lot of it, as you say, I mean, it's common sense, right? I mean, you're trying to document it, trying to make it clear, you're trying to make sure that you don't run into problems later. But it's just that discipline, I think, more than anything else, to actually sit down and say, okay, this is actually really important, and I'm gonna have to say, no, I can't get you that within the next hour because I've got to do these things. Is a huge.
Well, if I do get it to you within the next hour, it could contain an error, and I am simply not prepared to take that risk.
There you go. Yes, absolutely. So as compared to it will just give you the wrong outcome, right?
Yes.
There you go. Awesome. Well, listen, thanks. It's been awesome having you with us here. And I promise that I will get you an outline for doing a presentation at your group as well. Hopefully we'll be able to get you back to do something like this in the future as well. This is great.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me, Ken.